Next slide. Next slide. Perfect. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Elise Hanchuk. I'm one of the curators of this year's festival, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this year's Transmediale and this coming lecture titled The Proxy Landscape in False Color by Gerard Pietrusko. Robert is an architect, a composer, an educator based in New York, whose research and practice focus on the history and speculative design potential of environmental media. He is also currently an associate professor of landscape architecture at the University of Pennsylvania. There will be about a 40-minute talk, and then there will be about 15 minutes for conversation afterward. We'll take questions from the audience here, of course, but also for those of you watching elsewhere on the live stream, you can join the Telegram group and enter your questions there. So please, without further ado, please welcome me in joining, please join me, in welcoming Robert Pietrusko to the Transmediale stage. Thank you.
Thanks, Elise. We've all seen them. We've all felt the emotive effect as they render the vegetal world in we're off to a tough start here. Saturated reds, pinks, and cyans. False color aerial images offer us a hyper-aestheticized depiction of the landscape, especially in times of crises. They demonstrate that landscapes requiring our care can also be visually striking and appealing. With a sensitivity to the infrared portion of the electromagnetic spectrum, false color images claim to reach beyond the limits of human vision. We are invited to look closely, to devote our attention to images that seem to reach into the heart of the matter, showing things as they really are. Quote, they reveal, we are told, the invisible. Used this way, false color images exhibit a profound irony. They are divorced from their original context and the extremely complicated context of military reconnaissance. There's a whole network of invention, interpretation, decision-making for which they were originally intended. Rather than inviting us to look closely at vegetation, immersing ourselves in details, these images were intended to represent something else somewhere else, and at radically different scales. Developed within the R&D cauldron of US Cold War intelligence, false color images of North American landscapes were used as proxies for the Soviet economy and its broader geopolitical capacity. Through a series of translations, intelligence analysts looked at the detailed shades of vegetal red and saw Eurasian crop yields, Soviet caloric needs, and the economic infrastructure of third world proxy wars, thus turning small variations of infrared reflection into global foreign policy and military strategy. On 9 March 1969, from an altitude of 150 miles, Apollo 9 astronauts shot photographs of the Earth's surface over a period of 3 days. They were directed to secure photography over 50 different foreign countries and geographic areas. Called the Apollo Synoptic Photography Experiment, its resultant images were often circulated throughout the public, or as a marvel of what the vantage point of space photography could reveal about the Earth's surface. In actuality, these images were a study in photointelligence, secured over different land cover types in different countries, to see what natural resources and aspects of human land use could be identified, measured, and assessed for larger political significance. With the moonshot endgame already in sight for the Apollo program, NASA was pointing its attention back towards Earth, anticipating how space technology could be used for planetary management of resources. Of course, mineral extraction, but more importantly, the measurement, cataloging, and calculation of the planet's caloric yields stored in its varied croplands. NASA, US Geological Survey, and their network of academic agronomists, physicists, and botanists were anticipating the creation of orbital satellites that would image the planet on a repetitive basis. The Apollo 9 photography mission was a practical study of spectral analysis, imagery, and interpretation that would inform the sensor design of NASA's Landsat satellite, ultimately launched in 1972. But looking backwards from 1969, this specific agenda had been anticipated 3 years earlier with the foundation of NASA's Earth Resources Program. Wernher von Braun, NASA's chief rocket scientist, described the potential of space technology for addressing planetary needs of food security. Speculating during an interview in 1966 with the US News and World Report, von Braun stated, quote, "It has been demonstrated with airplane flights, using some sophisticated equipment and remote sensors, that from high altitudes you can distinguish very clearly rye from barley, soybeans from oats. Moreover, you can distinguish healthy crops from sick ones. By continuously surveying the tilled areas of the world, you can predict very well the crop expectations at the global scale." As you get closer to harvest, you can, by feeding all of that information into a computer, predict how much of a crop to expect, what kind, when, and where. Seemingly ignoring the primary role of NASA as a tool of Cold War brinksmanship, von Braun appeared to be describing a future and optimistic use of the program's technical capacities to more equitably distribute the world's caloric abundance, essentially using aerial surveillance to address global hunger. The future deployment of NASA satellites over foreign countries, especially those of the Sino-Soviet bloc, was, however, a touchy subject. Earth Resources were precisely the rebranding NASA required to assert their status as a benevolent civilian agency, a message that had been complicated after several PR missteps where NASA was found to be supporting US military operations in Southeast Asia. We don't hear a lot about that, but that's true. Not everyone, however, found von Braun's picture of the future to be so imaginative or speculative. In a 1967 secret report, CIA analyst William Gasser was bemused by the German scientist's apparent vision. After quoting von Braun at length, Gasser wrote that what the rocket scientists thought might be possible after the moon landing had already been established by CIA analysts in the 1960s, quote, well in advance of the interview. Gasser was referring to CIA's top-secret Chitter program, where analysts were interpreting crop distribution, crop health, and the potential caloric yields of agricultural areas, using images collected by high-altitude reconnaissance planes. As he described it, photography was taken at various scales and altitudes, using custom filters, film stocks, and experimental visualizations to test the interpretability of different vegetal species and their health, to predict, as von Braun had described, potential yields of grain, i.e. calories, across the globe. After the launch of the first Landsat satellite in 1972, small-scale, false-color images of global landscapes became available to researchers at a cadence of every 18 days. And in the 50 years since, these images have connected to and reinforced a narrative of global stewardship, resource management, and environmental forensics. So things like the tracking of toxic oil spills, deforestation, massive wildfires. Each of these topics are supported by psychedelic visualizations that have become one of the graphic design standards of the Anthropocene. The end of the world is, if anything, visually evocative and consistently beautiful. And yet, the specific way that these images look, despite their affective appeal, are often presented to us as matter of fact, a mere outcome of the necessity for analyzing ecological dynamics with infrared radiation. In short, a black box simply labeled science. But we are not able to so neatly divorce these images from their history, from the world in which they emerged, either the visual culture of the 1960s or the Cold War context of their creation, and not merely a general Cold War milieu, but as direct and explicit Cold War technology. There appears to be a very clear lineage from the Apollo 9 photographic experiment to the Landsat program. That's well documented. But the CIA Chitter program is obscured. With NASA's Landsat satellite and the narrative of global resource management determining our understanding of these images. But the existence of chitter as a precursor that somehow seemingly arrived at the same visual language with seemingly the same goals is evidence that false color images of global landscapes had actually been created within a different epistemological framework than the one that we currently assign to it. The way we visualize the world through these images and the inferential approach that remotely sensed images seem to require was not a scientific necessity, but a geopolitical one. The researchers who designed the Apollo 9 photographic mission, who proposed the spectral specifications and their methods of visualizations, were precisely the same researchers who executed the demonstration projects predicted by von Braun. But more importantly, these were also precisely the same researchers funded by the CIA's Chitter program to develop these techniques as tools of Cold War reconnaissance, an ongoing relationship that began at the beginning of the CIA's conception during the late 1940s. And it is in this mangle of associations here that we will explore, slowly, in an attempt to give meaning to the colors and tones we still use to look at the world in ecological distress. A proxy, a substitute, a stand-in, intended to represent something else or somewhere else. Remote sensors like Landsat and the false color visualizations that go along with them assume a remoteness that is not at all about altitude, but about geopolitics, denied territories, inaccessibility. They therefore assume that images, and only images, can be used to extract information. They rely on inference, things like spectral reflectances, which we're about to discuss, as well as the presence or absence of vegetation. These are used as a stand-in for the thing that is actually of interest. The above-mentioned researchers, who had worked both for the CIA and who had developed Landsat spectral specification, were stationed in the South Pacific during the Second World War. They imagined vegetation as a proxy for terrain and ultimately used it as a way to map inaccessible enemy territory. Given the researchers' various degrees in botany, plant physiology, and soil science, they understood vegetation as a manifestation of its environment, and that it could provide evidence of what the underlying terrain was like. During the post-war period, the researchers continued to develop these techniques. The proxy war on the Korean Peninsula during the first half of the 1950s sparked a belief that a full-on ground war with communist forces was inevitable, and that terrain maps of Soviet territory would soon be a necessity. Though US intelligence officers did not have access to the vast Eurasian landscape, botany, of all things, armed them with an ecological imagination. The soils, climate, and physiographic features of the North American landscape could serve as a viable proxy for the ground conditions US troops would encounter in Eurasia. And these could be mapped by proxy, by analyzing vegetal patterns in aerial imagery. The researchers conducted numerous studies in North American sites that were chosen specifically for their ability to stand in for important Soviet landscapes. There are scalar jumps implied by using vegetation as a proxy. The researchers believed that by studying the immediate relationship between a plant and its environment, i.e. soil, moisture, salinity, slope, they could map full territories implicitly in terms of military terrain. And throughout the 1950s, they indirectly mapped Soviet terrain using North American vegetation in this way. So here, we're looking at mountain terrain in the Soviet territory, mapped through vegetation in the Nahanni Mountains. And then lastly, we can see here how there's a list of sites here, a hand-drawn map of sites within Russia to be mapped, that are currently being mapped, or have already been mapped using this technique. For the remainder of the Cold War, when the mutually assured destruction arising from a nuclear conflict made a direct confrontation between East and West less immediately likely, US analysts continued to use vegetation as a surrogate for aspects of their communist adversaries, and did so in increasingly abstract ways. Cereal crop yields in North America were translated, scaled, and interpreted as a proxy for Soviet foreign policy. Now, as bizarre as this might sound, there were a series of concrete material assumptions that allowed this to appear as a common sense approach. On the other side of the world, beginning in the 1950s, US researchers attempted to measure annual crop yields in Soviet agricultural territories indirectly. The crop type, the number of bushels, the caloric content. They understood that the stability of the Soviet system relied on its ability to reproduce daily life in a way that posed an alternative to capitalism. The US policy of containment assumed that the Soviet system would ultimately collapse under its own weight if it was buffered, bounded, and forced to play out its own internal contradictions. The success or failure of Soviet crops was a large part of this dynamic. Now, immediately after World War II, military analysts attempted to calculate the quantitative correlation between reliable food supplies and a functioning society. They measured the continuum between peace and complete societal breakdown in calories and body mass. This was initially intended to predict the political stability of war-torn countries, both in Asia and in Europe after World War II. But it soon applied to the communist countries themselves, and it embodied the famous quote by journalist Alfred Henry Lewis, quote, "The only barrier between us and anarchy is the last 9 meals we've had." And this quote, 1896, is incidentally the same year that the calorie was adopted as a standard of comparison. Access to this knowledge became even more dire with Khrushchev's Virgin Lands project, which proposed turning millions of unused acres of territory into new productive agricultural fields. However, without direct access to Soviet territory, it was not possible to directly observe the health of Soviet agriculture, and by extension, the health of the Soviet economy. The communist agricultural landscape was a black box, withdrawn, inaccessible, and unknowable, seemingly. Working within an extremely complicated nexus of military intelligence, domestic federal agencies, and academic departments, researchers treated numerous sites in the North American landscape as climatological, physiological, and vegetal proxies for communist agricultural landscapes. Compiling vast amounts of meteorological and soil data, the researchers determined areas where crops commonly grown in communist territories would have a similar response to their environment. Now, these are areas in the US. In these locations, regression models and Bayesian decision models were created to associate temperature, humidity, and precipitation on the one hand, associate these with the health of cereal crops and their potential yields. The implications for foreign intelligence were clear. The direct relationship between crops and weather observed in North America could apply anywhere in the world that was identified as an agricultural correlate. As the analysts saw it, one only needed weather data and the number of acres in a foreign land to anticipate how much grain was produced. Proxy sites and their targets became conflated cartographically. A map of the Ukraine gives us just one of many examples, and it shows how geography collapsed in the minds of military strategists. We have another scalar move here, where the map toponymy, I hate that word, reflects the confused space of target and proxy, rendered as one and the same. So when we look at these maps, are we viewing Kyiv or Minnesota, Odessa or Montana, Kharkiv or North Dakota? The same was true in Asia. Have we mapped Manchuria or Manitoba, Hunan or Kentucky, Tibet or New Mexico? Returning to the quote by the journalist, "The only barrier between us and anarchy, blah, blah, blah," by 1947, it had been updated with an appropriately Cold War tone. Every man is only 9 meals away from communism. Better be good meals. The knowledge of Soviet economic health mediated through crop yields, implied an even more spatially ambitious proxy at the full scale of Cold War geopolitics. According to intelligence analysts, crop yields could also indicate communist capacity to support proxy wars in other parts of the world. In 1965, a secret agency-wide memo and a related call for proposals was circulated throughout the CIA, stating, I'm going to quote at length here, "The crop yields of the USSR and Communist China not only play a large part in their internal economies, but determine, the D word, determine to a large degree how much assistance these countries can give to smaller nations which they are attempting to convert to communism. We believe, therefore, that for a number of years it will be important to know how successful these and possibly other countries are in meeting their goals in agriculture." So it's not hard to read between the lines here in 1965 and see the increasingly dire situation in Indochina as being an important consideration. All right, so to say it clearly and to feel for a moment some amazement was implied by their project here, crop yields, as interpreted from aerial photographs, could be translated to represent the full communist economy and suggest a map of global communist investment in smaller nations around the globe from a single grain to the entire world. It was to this broad directive that the CIA's Chitter program responded when they developed the topic, the approach, and the false color visualizations that ultimately became part of the Apollo 9 photography mission and the Landsat program more broadly. But what about the color images themselves? How do they enter into the story about grains, economic proxies, and geopolitics? How are their striking colors instrumental? And how do they inform the calculations made by CIA analysts? When looking at aerial photographs of North America then, were image interpreters seeing the US landscape at all? Or were they peering through them, beyond them, into denied spaces, and to the larger geopolitical dynamics? It is not what the photograph represents that is important, but the effects it causes in the world. Military researchers working with a reconnaissance mindset were looking for a sympathetic relationship between electromagnetic energy on the one hand and caloric energy on the other, a relationship that could be understood through the concept of a photo-optical system. Going back a bit, in 1947, Arthur Eames and Lawrence McDaniels published their textbook, An Introduction to Plant Anatomy. It featured a diagram of a wheat stalk and its microscopic structure. You can see it here. In section, it highlighted chloroplast and the spongy mesophyll. Now, in 1952, over a decade before their work on Apollo or Chitter, our researchers took this diagram and layered it with energy flows from a photoreconnaissance system, thus making the microscopic structure of the plant into an optical filter. Its pattern of spectral reflectances was reinterpreted in the language of engineering, of circuits, signals, and frequency-dependent impedances. It was drawn as a filter that passed some wavelengths while attenuating or completely filtering others. When describing the pass bands and the stop bands of this plant filter, they highlighted that blue and red wavelengths were largely absorbed or filtered. Lost sound. Okay, sorry. They highlighted that blue and red wavelengths were largely absorbed or filtered by chloroplast, and that green wavelengths were reflected or passed by the filter, and that finally infrared was passed by the mesophyll layer given certain conditions. This last characteristic was important. As crop health was compromised, the mesophyll structure collapsed and therefore filtered infrared wavelengths. So as a result, the amount of infrared light that was passed or filtered varied in correspondence with crop health and by extension with crop yields. So just to say that again, they were trying to find this relationship that as crop health changed, so did infrared reflection in the plant, and it was because of this mesophyll layer. The plant as filter diagram circulated in numerous reports, publications, and a variety of gray literature throughout the 1950s and 60s. Explicitly, it depicted the relationship between plant physiology and spectra, but had a more important implication for reconnaissance. It meant that variations in crop health could be translated into variations of photographic tone, which then could be measured and correlated with caloric yields. This diagram lays hidden behind images such as these, produced in the 1950s, as well as the massive number of false color images that were soon to come. The researchers conducting this early work used photography to jump numerous scales, from the incredibly small wheat samples required for spectral analysis, to individual wheat stalks, to large fields, to full agricultural regions, and ultimately to the status of an entire harvest. Spectral curves, conceiving of the plant as an optical filter, meant that its spectral response could be diagrammed like a filter circuit, using a wavelength and amplitude notation. The information contained in these spectral curves were assumed to be consistent across scales and transportable across time, space, and extent, thereby creating associations amongst them. All right, so curves like this head in two directions for us. Headed in the direction down towards the ground, changes in these curves could be correlated with directly observable changes in health, and by extension, associated with anticipated yields. Headed in the other direction, towards the sky and the aerial camera, changes in the reflectance curve could be correlated with specific shifts in photographic tone, to be deciphered by the eye of a photo interpreter. It is here, then, that the CIA desire to remotely quantify crop yields found its first expression, where spectral analysis and aerial photography related the nuanced physiological characteristics of crops with a region's total agricultural yield, and created a proxy for the broader geopolitics of the Cold War. But again, what about these resultant images? Despite the often heard claim that infrared photography, quote, reveals the invisible, these images were not about revealing anything at all. Instead, they were concerned solely with correlation. The scale of the photographs alone defy any chance for mimesis, reduced to fully abstract tonal patterns. It became a case of identifying colors, measuring areas, and computing grains to be entered into a table, annotated, and passed along the chain of command to those shaping US foreign policy. Returning to the Apollo 9 synoptic photography mission, it was the first multispectral mission in space. We saw these images earlier. Astronauts shot black and white photographs through highly selective optical filters, each recording a specific zone of the electromagnetic spectrum. It was an extrapolation of the previous visual bifurcation that parceled light into binary classes, into visible regions and infrared regions. It had used a 2-camera system, but in the case of Apollo 9, it was expanded into 3. The 4th camera in this system contained Kodak color infrared film, which was used for comparison. When combining these black and white spectral bands into a color image, where does the false from false color come from? Is it merely the substrate upon which other culturally important details ride? In the previous sections, I seem to be conflating infrared photography in general with false color imagery. However, they're not the same. Despite the aesthetic appeal of these images, the sensations they cause are often discussed as an after effect. We are told that they are the result of a seemingly straightforward translation, a teleological progression out of the visual range and into portions of the spectrum that we cannot see. Sensors and film emulsions that are sensitized to deeper shades of red, and our dyes and color channels merely follow suit. Though it is an accurate description of what's going on, it is not an accurate explanation. Progressing into the spectral frontier does have a romantic intrepidness about it, and one that was supported by the researchers themselves, at least in a small way. This is real, it's from a technical document. As they moved everything's real, but this one, begs the question. As they moved further up the electromagnetic spectrum into new and unvisited territories, where access was restricted to those with proper military clearance, only artistic depictions were allowed to be brought back to show what was experienced there. Though this provides a tidy narrative and a legible diagram, and I wish this were accurate, I love this diagram, it's not historically true. It inverts the order of priorities. The standard false color visualization did not adhere to some notion of spectral progression or a simple remapping. The resulting color scheme instead emerged from numerous iterations and was an intentionally designed specification. So here, taking an anecdote from Life magazine to describe this sensibility, its 30th anniversary issue was published in 1966, at the same time that von Braun was giving his interview. Numerous advances in photography were highlighted in this issue, including multispectral approaches. A small garden in South Beach, Miami was rendered in striking false color, and the researchers involved with the study, incidentally also involved with the Apollo 9 mission, same folks, used 4 cameras to photograph the scene in multiple black and white spectrally filtered images. Back in the lab, quote, the films were combined with colors, again another quote, both true and false. They produced literally thousands of combinations to enhance the differences between details that interested them in a highly iterative and pragmatic fashion. In spite of its familiar content, here, trees in a garden, readers are told how to interpret the image. And in an ironic inversion where color no longer has conventional meaning, red vegetation is healthy, and green vegetation, they are reminded that green vegetation here is actually sick. Life magazine presented to a popular audience a technique that had first been demonstrated 20 years earlier with the creation of color infrared film. In the late 1940s, military researchers presented a new film stock at a meeting of the Optical Society of America. For the first time, there was a photographic process described as false color. In my archival work, I have uncovered what I believe to be the earliest false color image seen here, and this is of the form that we've been talking about. Despite color fading over the last 80 years, the most definitive features are still present, like red vegetation by way of infrared. Elsewhere, I presented a more thorough analysis of this image, but for now, I simply want to highlight the epistemology present at the conception of false color aerial imagery. And the researchers explain it this way. The technique was developed during the war for detecting camouflage. We all know that, which would stand out as greenish against a red background of grass. Unlike the previous example from Life magazine with literally thousands of combinations, this film was standardized, so infrared mapped to red, red mapped to green, green mapped to blue. Seems to have that sort of spectral progress that I was talking about. And this would then become the canonical palette for colorizing infrared photography. But in spite of this standard, The researchers were sure to highlight that this palette was arbitrary, in some sense up for grabs. Camouflage could just as easily be mapped to red against a background of green, or any other colors. And in fact, numerous variations were considered before arriving at the version we now take for granted. Okay, so across 20 years, there are some things common to both accounts here. The researchers are not after representational mimetic techniques. Photographic processes are harnessed for geographic visualization, but they're not within the standard claims of aerial photography. There's no discussion of a God's eye view, seeing the ground anew with clarity, or that the truth of the ground is revealed from the vantage point of being above. None of that, they don't talk about it that way at all. Instead, they're attempting to enhance or make something stand out, features against a background, to create a visual contrast specifically with an image interpreter in mind. In this case, any color technique is considered that increases the contrast between what is sought and what is seen as noise, especially when intended for use over enemy territory. Towards these ends, an ability to recombine or revisualize requires a decoupling between the photosensitive emulsions and the dyes used to create visual effects. Here, color is merely thematic, and the viewer is asked to suspend their assumptions and to consult their most basic sensations, to detect colors rather than content. The goal of this photography, when stated coarsely, shifted from representation of objects to interpretation by subjects. And though beautiful, the approach was not frivolous. As we look at images from projects, this is from CIA's Chitter program that I talked about before, ones that sought to interpret crop yields from afar, we see the same experimental and iterative approach to depicting their subject matter. There's no adherence to an object's natural color, only a desire to find a combination of colors that will produce the necessary visual contrast for identification and analysis. As these same researchers proposed the final specification for the Landsat multispectral scanning system, they imagined that, again, literally thousands of visual combinations could be achieved that would highlight all manner of natural resources and human land uses to the eye of an interpreter, and demonstrated it with a similar experimental fervor. In this final section, I'd like to make a small overture towards the relationship between false color images and the visual culture of the 1960s. They existed as part of a general structure of feeling. In photography, film, and other practices of light, sensing and depiction were now fully decoupled from each other. All sorts of experiments with RGB channel inversions, registration errors, additive dye processes ran rampant. I'm sure many of you are very familiar with all of this. And here, a small clip from Kubrick's 2001. This is something I'm going to come back to shortly. There was an implication that experiments with perception were the pathway to new conceptual frameworks and cosmologies. It was a desire for the radical free play of sensation, or said another way, perhaps a bit trite, to literally see things differently allowed one to think new thoughts. I'm going to make a slight footnote here that the discovery of LSD was also an unintended outcome of 1950s crop research, much like these images. In any case, the epistemic conceits of false color visualizations therefore seem timely, given that they too were tools for creating new sensations through which military interpreters could experience the landscape symbolically rather than scientifically. It was on these grounds that the technique could be plucked from their original context and given new cultural meanings. Here, Kubrick's 2001: A Space Odyssey serves as an example for the translation of these images into the broader visual culture. During the Jupiter space sequence, we view an alien landscape from an aerial oblique vantage point, rendered in false colors. It has a familiar physiography, but it seems to interact differently with the electromagnetic spectrum. To create this sequence, Kubrick's team filmed common and accessible landscapes, so Mountain Valley in the US and the Hebrides Islands in Scotland. Like the preceding projects, Kubrick's familiar landscapes were rendered in false color to represent foreign or inaccessible ones, an alien world rather than the adversarial territory of the Sino-Soviet bloc. And while making the film, Kubrick famously consulted with NASA engineers on all aspects of their work. His study of NASA spacecraft has received the most attention, but for me, his filmic approach during this sequence is equally fascinating. In a personal correspondence with Kubrick's lead special effects artist, Doug Trumbull, I learned that they deployed similar techniques as the researchers I've focused on in this lecture, and these images come from him. Specifically, they derived a chart of color channels, dyes, and reversals on which to permutate, and then used random number generators to assign them values. This was a technique they called purple hearts, named playfully after the amphetamines that were commonly took among mods at the time. This process could generate literally thousands of possible landscape visualizations, similar to the additive color experiments featured both in Life magazine and as part of the Apollo 9 mission. Therefore, the conceptual underpinning and the technical procedures are the same, though the ultimate outcome was assessed on purely artistic grounds. The desire to correlate new visual experiences with inaccessible lands draws a legible thread, therefore, from Cold War military aesthetics to popular culture. The power of these images does not come from the claim that they reveal more of nature than the human eye can see, or that they offer a more intense correspondence with the thing being photographed. In spite of how we currently discuss them, the relationship between these images and a strict representational enterprise is too unstable for this to be the case. This is also true of their original conception as a proxy, that is, to implicitly represent something else somewhere else, but also in their experimental hot swapping and remapping of wavelengths and colors. When pulled out of the context of military reconnaissance, we find instead that their usefulness lies in their aesthetic appeal, the ability to produce sensations and affects that harness our attention, in short, to compel us towards the world. Their relation to our senses has always been their purpose, and this has also always been their power and their real authority. It's an invitation to continue mobilizing aesthetics in this way, to engage in free experimentation with our representations without requiring a narrative of scientific practices to justify it. And as our researchers themselves described as early as 1947, the colors in any color photograph are, quote, false in any case. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Elise.
We have about 15 minutes. Sorry? Pardon me. We have 11 minutes for questions from the audience. If you want to put up your hand. Sorry, I can't see anyone. Oh, so some microphones will be brought to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this performance lecture. I would like to ask if colorblindness played any role in figuring out the color scheme. And I would also like to know about your choice of this music, which to me was very much cosmic.
I can't see who I'm talking to. There you are. Thank you. Thank you for that question. It's fantastic. So colorblindness in the training of photo interpreters, colorblindness would have been one of the criteria that they chose to omit certain people. So they first defined and determined a standard interpreter, someone that had a predictable set of sensations. They actually tested them on their experience of color. And then once, sort of like white lab rats, they have a set of characteristics that in the photo interpretation lab could be seen as repeatable. Those were then the interpreters that they tuned and tailored the image schemes in order to sort of trigger these color contrasts. So color blindness shows up, but earlier in the process as a way of filtering people out of their candidacy for being image interpreters. And also, thank you for the comment on the soundtrack and the music. These are all pieces that I've made, and given the sort of additive aspect of the visual thing, I found, interestingly, a lot of correspondence between music and imagery in the 1960s with the focus on spectra and additive combinations as the way of synthesizing sensations. So certainly in sound, the FFT, of course emerging from nuclear research, becomes a tool for generating experimental compositions. They're playing with spectra at the same time that these folks are playing with spectra and images. And there's a lot of actually diagrammatic correspondence here. I feel like I'm giving someone a PhD topic in the audience. Anyway, I'll keep it short. So given that, I just did a lot of work with FFT analysis and additive synthesis in order to have something that I thought was at least aesthetically consistent.
Thank you. Next question. I think there were some hands up in the back. No? Sorry, I'm also checking the online stream to see if there's questions. Oh, sorry, we have Ryan in the front.
Oh dear.
Can we have one?
Careful.
Thank you. I like this participation.
It's a bit like the Olympics.
Thank you.
So, Bobby, thanks a lot. That was brilliant, as always. Just a very large question, actually, to let you play with just a bit. One of the things, because you ended on the idea of aesthetics as the driving force here, and the relationship between aesthesis, which is pure, unfiltered perception, and aesthetics, which necessitates a value judgment. All of this seems geared only towards the latter side of this, which is signal and noise, right? That relationship that we keep coming back to. So I guess the issue I want to address here is what is the ground upon which all of this is built, if there is one? Mm-hmm. Or is it all an infinite play of an interpretation between aesthesis and aesthetics and noise and signal? But keeping in mind, we only know what one is because of the other.
Yeah, we only have figures when we have ground. Yes. And I think that's absolutely the crucial point here, that sort of old adage that the difference that makes a difference, right? That here we're trying to find color contrasts, differences, that allows one to make a concrete decision. And that's the thing too here, that decision, certainly in the early days of information theory, the bit is the ability to decide between two states. 0 and 1 is not the ground of this. The decidability of something. That's the foundation of information theory. And so these things are tied, that perception that creates the condition where one can make a judgment. This is present versus that. It doesn't matter what it is. It's red versus cyan. I can see where that edge is. That ability to decide is the foundational thing here. And in fact, when they end up in sort of organizational settings, interpreters are not asked to even label the thing, just merely make the decision. What the thing is happens further up in the organizational chain. So this idea of judgment here, it isn't even then categorize and assess. It's merely what you're saying. Is the signal present? Can it be detected? And the color schemes were all about that. how can we optimize our ability to detect contrast?
And that distinction is built into the design at the outset. So the judgment is already, it's kind of the same thing in the same
Yeah. No, I mean, that's the thing, it's baked in. So when we use these images and say, look what they reveal precisely what they were tailored to reveal. And that's the thing about it, that they don't have a clean channel for where we're finding new things. They're channeling our perception towards a particular way of viewing the landscape.
Thank you. If you have a question, please wave your hand. It's a bit hard to see up here. We have a question at the back, at the very back, also in the middle. If you can leave the microphone, if you can leave the microphone with the person asking the question until the question's answered, in case they have a follow-up, thanks.
First of all, thank you so much for your wonderful lecture. I guess my question was about false color in its use facing outward. I felt like everything was very focused on looking at the earth, looking down at ourselves, looking in the mirror, so to speak. And there's also so much of that technology leveraged for looking outward into the cosmos, looking at the infrared background radiation that allows us to perceive time and so many other things. And I'd just love to hear some of your thoughts on looking outward as well.
Yeah, no, that's a really great question. It's at the edge of what my research is, and it's sort of a place of anxiety for me, where I'm like, pretty soon I'll be talking about visualizing the entire universe. But you're totally right. They do use these techniques. The reason why I limit sort of my study to the time period that I do, and therefore it becomes Earth-focused, is just simply kind of my interest in sort of Cold War environments and environmental history. But once they develop these spectral techniques, as you well know, they then use the same approaches for looking outwards. And they kind of had all this funded research for looking at the Earth, and they could take these same approaches and point them at the sky. Now, of course, the color schemes change, the standards change. They're not basing it on sort of an ontology of photography. So it ends up getting different. And to be totally honest, those differences are outside of my expertise. I'm not quite sure. But there is kind of a moment where it is derived primarily for looking at the Earth in this Cold War context. And then, much like it circulates in visual culture, it circulates in scientific culture, where the term false color now can be applied to all sorts of imaging approaches.
Thank you.
Great, thanks.
Thank you so much. Hello. Thank you. Thank you so much for your question. We have time for one more question before we wrap. Oh, there we go. Mackenzie in the front, please.
Fascinating, thank you. In the context of the Cold War, did it work? Like, did weaponizing infrared actually work in terms of the geopolitics of that era?
Yeah, so for a number of these, they were kind of dead in the water. They would spend all this money on them, and they would map things, and then as far as I could follow the chain, they never ended up getting used for anything. It's just all of this kind of anticipation, and then they sort of get more use out in these civilian settings. But yeah, many of the projects that I showed, they're funded. They produce all this great literature, and then I can't find any trace of them showing up in actual, military technology in the form that they did. So it's kind of all mothballed.
Yeah. That's a common story with these projects at that time. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Mackenzie.
Thank you so much for your question. Bobby, thank you so much for your talk. As
My pleasure.
always, it was a pleasure. We're going to take a break now. No, wait, sorry. We have a brief film screening. Sorry, I knew I was going to screw that up. We have a brief film screening titled The Higher the Risk with Upche, Nina Davies, and Ryan Jeffrey. And then there will be a break, followed at 3 p.m. by a lecture performance by Georgina Voss. Thank you all again so much for joining us, and see you in a bit.